This episode is brought to you by my Fertility Friday group programs. New groups are starting in April of 2017, and there are only a limited number of spaces available. Make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to reserve your spot today. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 128. Welcome to the 128th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. Welcome and thank you for joining me today. I am so excited to be here with you. There's a couple of things that I wanted to share with you before I jump into the show. And one of them is that for the month of March, I actually have some really special episodes coming up for you. I'm doing a bit of a series, jumping into more of a fertility awareness reality type theme once again. And I will be interviewing a number of members from the Fertility Friday community and really giving the opportunity to share their stories. One of the things that I find most powerful, especially doing this podcast, although I love interviewing guests who have various expertise in their field, I do find that when I share stories of real women and what they've experienced, whether it's coming off of hormonal contraceptives or trying to conceive and how that played out, I find those stories really resonate with you, with the audience. And that's one of the reasons why I typically draw out the real stories that inspired the experts and health professionals that I have on the show, what inspired them to actually delve into their field. Because I find that those are the stories and the experiences that really move us and really help us to just appreciate how much these situations can impact us personally, can impact our menstrual cycle, and just our health overall. And I also wanted to share with you that I have opened up enrollment for the next round of my Fertility Friday group programs. I'm so excited to start the new programs in April coming up here. So if you're listening in real time and you're thinking about being part of the group, I would encourage you to head over to the group program page, which you'll find at fertilityfriday.com/group program. There is a limited number of spaces that I have available. So if you're thinking about being part of the groups, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and jump in and apply today while there's still space. So at the time of this recording, I still have spaces available. And yeah, so today's episode, I'm actually going to be talking to you about sex. It's something that comes up at some point in my one-on-one sessions with clients, as well as the group program. And there's a number of reasons why it comes up. So I'm really excited to chat with you about that. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. All right, ladies, today we're going to be talking about sex, a topic that comes up in most of my one-on-one sessions at one point or another. And it typically also comes up in my group sessions. And it comes up in a number of ways for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons that it comes up is that when I'm working with a client one-on-one and we're delving into her chart, naturally the timing of sex and also when it's happening in the cycle, those types of things, those play a really important role in how effective the fertility awareness method is going to be for you. So naturally, those conversations are going to happen and those types of things are going to come up. And so naturally, if I'm looking at your chart, one of the things that I have to do is pay attention to when you're having sex in the cycle. And also if you're marking it down and make sure that you have an understanding whether you're trying to conceive or whether you're trying to avoid pregnancy of when the correct time is in the cycle. It's really interesting. I'll link back to the episode that I recorded with Dr. Carrie Hampton. I actually recorded 2 episodes with her, so I'll link both of those in the show notes. But it's really interesting. She did research specifically on women who had been trying to conceive for a year or more and found themselves in an IVF clinic type of situation. And you would think that if a woman was actively trying to conceive for a year or more, that she would be the one that would have the best and most clear understanding of when she was ovulating in her cycle. But what her research found was that a surprisingly low number of women, a low percentage of women who had been trying to conceive for a year or more had a really clear understanding of when to time sex. And one of the reasons that is, from my perspective, what I've seen with clients, as well as my perspective just overall, is that even though you're learning fertility awareness and you're starting to gain an understanding of how your fertile window works and cervical mucus and when ovulation happens in the cycle, we've really been programmed to believe that ovulation happens on day 14. And so I've seen it in some of the women that I've worked with, many of the women that I've worked with, where even though there's that understanding of mucus and its relationship to fertility, we're still timing sex based on the understanding of, well, I usually ovulate on this day of my cycle. And that plays out in a number of different ways. But suffice it to say that I do have to pay attention to when the sex is happening in the cycle. And sometimes what strikes me is when it's happening, but also when it's not happening. And so we're going to be talking about those things in a lot of detail in today's episode. That's why I'm really excited to share with you. I wanted to start my conversation about sex with really delving into a few of the common myths that I see. And I'm sure these are not the only myths, but these are the ones that I find really apply to the work that I do, and I'm sure that they'll apply to you as well. So I'd be really curious to hear if you've encountered these or if you still believe them to some extent. So the first myth that I want to share with you, I'm just going to lay it out there, is that there's something wrong with you if you don't orgasm from intercourse alone. And so I find the definition of sex to be very heterosexist, if that even makes sense. But basically, it's based on the definition of a man having sex with a woman. And ultimately, the sex starts when he has an erection. That's the quote unquote beginning of sex. And then the end of sex is when he ejaculates. And so the myth then that there's something wrong with you if you don't orgasm from intercourse alone is really interesting, because what the statistics say and what real actual women say is that the statistics show that over 70 to 80% of the time, women are not orgasming from intercourse alone. So, penile vaginal intercourse just by itself with no clitoral stimulation or any other type of manual stimulation, specifically of the clitoris, it's just not happening. And so I find that to be really interesting because this can play out in a number of ways. You may not overtly believe that there's something wrong with you, but in those moments when you're with your partner and you're not having an orgasm from sex alone, do you ever find yourself, thinking like, I wish I could speed this up, or what's wrong with me? Or do you ever find yourself even apologizing to your partner that you weren't able to climax, within a certain period of time and from the activity by itself? So I think it plays out in a number of different ways. And I think that myth is reinforced in a number of different ways, even if you don't actually think that you believe it. And so a fun example that I'd like to share with you is from my favorite show, Scandal. And so if any of you watch Scandal and love it like I do, then you've probably seen a number of really hot, steamy sex scenes, for instance, between Liv and Fitz, so two of the main characters. And so what I find really interesting about those sex scenes is that, they are hot and steamy and fun to watch, but ultimately it goes a little something like, she's there, they're making out, and literally like seconds later, they're thrusting and in the middle of this hot intercourse, sexy tryst situation. And it's like immediately she just is coming her brains out. Like, so she's having an orgasm just immediately. And it just all happens so fast. And the movies often show men and women having sex together and climaxing at the same time and within minutes of starting. And it just gives us a really false impression of what sex actually looks like, and a poor understanding of female sexual response and how it works and what it actually does take for a woman to orgasm. So I think that it's really important to point that myth out. And I think it's really important to work towards breaking that myth and really recognizing that most women do need clitoral stimulation to climax. And also the time frame in terms of how long it actually takes to get to that point is not often, 2 minutes within a partnered scenario. And so I think that in of itself can be helpful to get rid of that kind of blame or shame around it, thinking that there's something wrong with you. Because if you're in the midst of a sexual situation with your partner and your mind is filling with thoughts of, oh, there's something wrong with me, and oh, I wish I could just orgasm quicker, and oh, why isn't this happening for me? Then obviously that is a bit of a downer. And so those thoughts in and of themselves are going to have a negative impact on your sexual response during that time. So this plays right into the second myth that I just wanted to touch on, which is that foreplay isn't really sex. So as I alluded to in the first myth, there's this idea of sex that it starts with his erection and it ends with his ejaculation. And that's basically what our understanding is of what sex is. And anything outside of that, so any type of, manual stimulation, oral stimulation, any other type of sexual activity, throwing in a toy or anything like that, we downplay it to some degree and often just don't think of it as actual sex. So there's like the quote unquote real sex, and then there's the not real sex. And as I alluded to earlier, that is it also is a quite exclusive definition of sex that excludes couples that are not heterosexual. So it excludes same-sex partners, because then does that mean they're not really having sex? Like that doesn't even make sense. So I think one of the myths is just around what constitutes real quote unquote sex and what doesn't. And I think that if we can move away from that limited definition of what we consider sex to a more fluid definition to include other forms of sexual activity and be open to those, especially in the context of the first myth. So the first myth that there's something wrong with you if you don't orgasm just by intercourse alone. Well, if that's your only definition of sex, and then 70 to 80% of women don't orgasm from intercourse alone, well, then that really limits your chances of having an orgasm. And it creates this scenario where your orgasm there's more of a slim chance of it than what we would need for you to have one. And this is something that I feel really strongly about, because I have never met a man in my life who has never had an orgasm or usually doesn't have one during sex. Now, if you have met a man that has that experience where he either never has one or usually doesn't during sex, then that would be an interesting conversation for us to have. Because ultimately, because we have defined the sex cycle based on his arousal pattern, he always has an orgasm, or at least the majority of the time, and it's more of a rare occasion where in the scenario of, heterosexual sexual activity where he isn't reaching orgasm. And I think that then if we have that script in our mind of what constitutes sex, then if you're not orgasming in the same way that he is within the same time frame, then there's something wrong with you. But I would argue that if we broaden our definition of what we consider to be sex, then that would really shift our understanding of it and the way that we go about it. And so I'd like for you to imagine for a moment, what if instead of defining sex around his arousal patterns and his sexual response, that we defined it based on yours? So that sex started, whenever we're engaging in foreplay or any type of sexual activity, making out, but it didn't finish until you finished. So imagine for a moment what that would look like and how that understanding might shift your sexual activities or how you go about sex or how you think about it. I guess that's some food for thought. And I think it's a really important thing to think about, because although I recognize, neither men nor women necessarily orgasm every single time. Arguably, men are orgasming pretty close to 100% of the time during sexual activity. And then as women, that number is a lot lower. And so I feel like there's a lot that we could do to bring that number up, because orgasms are great. Who doesn't want to have an orgasm? And so this brings me to some of the other topics that I wanted to talk about today, which are some practical ways to improve sex. So I've already touched on some of them just by going through the myths, but there's a few that I wanted to chat with you about. So one of them sounds super unsexy, but I wanted to talk about it anyways, because I don't actually think it's as unsexy as it sounds. So the first one is scheduling sex. And so that plays into a myth that I could have spoken about in the myth section, that sex is, not necessarily all sex, but great sex is spontaneous. And I think that the media helps us with that one to make it seem as though in order for sex to be fun and exciting, it has to be a surprise, like you didn't know you were going to have sex. And all of a sudden, someone's sweeping you off into this magical sexual tryst. And it's really unexpected and exciting. And there's nothing wrong with that. That sounds great. But I think that for most of us in our day-to-day lives, that's not always realistic. And although I'm not opposed to random, fun sex that just organically happens, I think that that's great. I also think that I haven't really spoken to many people within the last 10 years who aren't super busy and really are, whether they're working quite a bit, whether they have families and children that keep them really busy. I just haven't met that many people in the last little while who don't have 1,000 things going on. And so with that being said, it's very easy for anything that you don't focus on to not to fall to the wayside a little bit and just not to receive the attention that it deserves. So I would argue that if you want to make something a priority in your life, you actually do have to schedule it or plan for it, or at least devote some attention to it. And something else that I've been thinking about as well is, even though we have this idea that great sex is spontaneous and scheduling it would ruin some of that allure and the flair, I would encourage you to think back to when you started dating your partner, if you're partnered, or a time when you were dating somebody, what that looked like in those first couple months. And I imagine that when you got together, you had to plan it and schedule it. And although there may not have been a specific, we're going to have sex at this time, there was likely some planning and preparation that did go into the times when you did have sex, whether that was scheduling a date or whether that was scheduling some time together or whatever it is. I'm guessing that you were quite intentional about it. And even beyond that part of it, when you got together, you also, did your hair and brushed your teeth and really showed up intently. And I think that we can all relate to that, from in those early periods of dating. And so even though we think that sex is generally spontaneous and great sex has to be, if we schedule it, then that means it's going to be boring, then I really would challenge that, because I feel like to some degree, if we're honest with ourselves, there was a good deal of scheduling that went on before, although it felt spontaneous just because of all the things that were happening. But, you still had to intentionally plan out those times when you were spending time together. And so, I think that it's practical in our day-to-day lives that are so busy to schedule date nights. It doesn't have to be like you schedule sex at this time, although it could be, but it could even just be making sure to schedule date nights. And it doesn't have to necessarily be out. It could be date nights out or date nights in. But I think that taking that extra care and attention, planning a special evening or afternoon, for example, when you've organized it so that you can be alone and you take some time to kind of prepare, whether it's your bedroom or something else, and make it into a special event for the two of you. I think that taking that extra care and time, although it would seem like, well, this is so unsexy to schedule sex, I think that you can choose to make it into something really great. And I think that also shows that you're taking it seriously, and you're also making a point to prioritize it. And by doing that, you're also prioritizing your relationship. And in the client work that I do, there's a lot of different scenarios that show up. And one of them, especially for couples who are trying to conceive actively and who have been trying for quite some time, is that the desire for having a family and the timed sex and really being intentional about when you're doing it, but for the purpose of trying to conceive, that whole aspect of it can really take over. And what happens is that fun, carefree, non-goal-oriented sex that you used to have can really go out the window a little bit and be replaced by this very specific kind of timed, planned sex. And so taking that extra time to schedule sex outside of all of that, I think, and really having that just be about connecting with each other and being intimate. And also a really important part of that is scheduling some time. So instead of just doing it super fast just to get over with. And again, I'm not opposed to a quickie, but my larger point there is really to take that time to enjoy and to take that time to really, to not have any of that time pressure around it. I think that is really important. And I just want to make a quick note about the time. And I want to share with you an analogy that I find to be really helpful in understanding more of the female sexual response pattern. And that is the analogy of the crock pot. So for all of you who have crock pots at home or who have used them, you'll know that crock pots heat up pretty slowly, and then they cook the food pretty slowly too. So until the food is done, it takes quite some time for the food to heat up. And you can compare that to a frying pan where you just, put the oil in and turn it up, and then the food cooks relatively quickly in comparison. And so we as ladies are typically the crock pot, where our arousal pattern and sequence, it doesn't just go from 0 to 100. It typically takes us a bit of time to warm up. And then it also takes us a little bit of time to get to that boiling point, that point of climax. Whereas the sexual response cycle that men go through is a bit different to that and can often be a little bit more fast, just in terms of, and visually too, because an erection is pretty obvious versus our sexual arousal patterns, which aren't as obvious, although we do have them. Our external sexual organs, vulva, the clitoris, they also fill with blood and become quote unquote erect, if you want to use that terminology to parallel. But obviously it's not as obvious. Like you'd really have to be looking at it, maybe with a flashlight or something to really see, although you may be able to feel it. But I digress a little bit, but I just wanted to share that with you, the crockpot analogy. And so that ties into the scheduling of sex and the allowing for enough time portion of it. Because anytime that you feel like there's only a certain amount of time, and if I don't, come within the next 20 minutes, then it's over, that is just not a good way to go into it. So there's nothing wrong with you if it takes you, quote unquote, a long time to have an orgasm. And if you think about it in a different way, then instead of thinking like it takes me so long, and reframe that to think, well, this means that I get to enjoy the sexual activity with my partner longer. And if you were to look at it in a different way, in a more positive way, and not have any time pressure, because as soon as you have that thought in your mind about, oh my goodness, I need to come, why is it taking so long? Then you know that's that's just going to make it so that it doesn't happen. And I think a lot of you listening can relate to that. Like as soon as you have that kind of mind chatter in your head in the midst of sexual activity, you know that then it's like it just shuts off. Like we just have this switch in our head that we can just shut off our sexual response system through our emotions and our thoughts. So I would encourage you to think about that and think about how looking at it that way could have a different impact on how you approach sex, and even how you think about the timing of it and what the whole sexual experience should look like. All right, so more practical ways to improve sex. The second one that I wanted to talk to you about is to show up with intention. And I've touched on this a little bit, but I think it's really important to consider that. So as I was saying before, anything in life that we don't put in our attention to, and anything that we don't focus on and prioritize, it can fall to the wayside. And so the same holds true for sex. And I love that dating analogy. So when you were dating, I'm guessing you were really intentional about how you approached the situation. So whether that's how, if you're going out together, how you're, putting yourself together, your outfits, your shoes down to your hair. If you just think about that period of time, you showed up with intention and you were probably fully present. You probably weren't checking your phone on those early dates and messaging somebody in the middle of the conversation or whatever the case is, but you were present and you fully showed up. And I think that that's really important for this process. And that ties right into to scheduling it, making a date, putting something on the calendar. And so during that time, if you fully blocked off that time, then you know that there's nowhere else that you're supposed to be. You made the time in your calendar. And in the same way that when your best friend wants to go out for coffee with you, you put it in your calendar and then you show up to Starbucks and you're there and you're present. In the same way, you want to show up for sex with your partner. And that brings me right into the third practical way to improve sex that I wanted to share with you, which is to stay in the moment. So the first thing is, of course, showing up. But then the second thing is to be present. And that means emotionally, not just physically. So a very obvious example of that is that in the midst of sexual activity, you're really not thinking about all of the things that happened at work today. You're not going through your head about all of the different things that need to be done around the house. You're not thinking about the laundry and the dishes and whether or not you remember to shut the porch light off. You're not thinking about tomorrow, what has to happen at work. And you're certainly not thinking about that fight that your partner and you had, 2 months ago or whatever it is. And that is a lot easier said than done. And I think that we're all human beings, so our mind is going to wander from time to time. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that it's just a reality of life. That's just how we are built. But I think it's important to at least consider having some strategies in place for when that does happen, or if it does happen, so that you can bring yourself back to the present. And I think that there's a number of really easy ways that you can do that. When I think about ways to bring myself back to the present, I often think about connecting to the five senses. So taste, touch, smell, eyesight, what you see, and also what you hear. And that has, I found that to be helpful in a number of different ways, from when I used to do yoga all the time to when I do meditation in the mornings. And I think that just remembering those five senses and connecting with those can really help you to stay in the present moment. So an example of that could be that if you find your mind wandering, you start taking some slow, deep breaths. And that can be helpful in a number of different ways, because that can increase, blood flow and oxygen and all of that. And that could potentially have a positive impact on your sexual response in general. But in addition to that, just taking some deep breaths and really focusing on your breath can help you if you find that your mind wanders. Another thing you can do is pay attention to the sensations in your body. So assuming that you're in the midst of a sexual experience, with your partner or even with yourself, then there's likely some really pleasurable sensations, physical sensations that you could be paying attention to instead of thinking about what needs to go into the dishwasher. And so that's one of the things that can help you to stay in the moment as well. So, taking some deep breaths, but also really focusing on the sensations in your body. When I say to focus on the sensations in your body, I mean the sensations that are happening now, and really staying in the moment and trying really hard not to worry about the future, worry about, am I going to have an orgasm in a few minutes, or oh, this isn't so kind of putting aside all of those things and just focusing on the sensations that are happening right now. And I mean, a couple of other things you could focus on. You could also use touch. You could, touch your partner's hair or something like that, and then really focus on whether it is the way that your partner's skin feels, or the warmth of your partner's skin, or just something touch oriented that could help you just to focus on that. And so, yeah, I think that if you go to those five senses, I didn't go through all of it. I'm sure that you can, come up with some others, but those things can really help you to stay present in the moment, so that your mind doesn't wander and you kind of disconnect from the actual situation at hand. And I think those things as well, I mean, your partner can probably tell when you're not paying attention. And so just being able to stay focused is also going to just improve that connection between the two of you. All right. So the fourth thing that I touched on this a little bit earlier as well. And so this part is something that I wanted to say specifically for women who are trying to conceive. So I think, as I alluded to before, there's a lot of, when you're trying to conceive actively, and especially the longer that you've been trying to conceive, then sex does turn into something different. So before you ever try to have babies, sex is often just carefree and fun, and there's no goal, it's not goal oriented, you're not looking for this specific outcome. And with that being said as well, because you're not looking for a specific outcome, you're not really particular about when you're having it and in what position you're having it and how you kind of behave before and after. So whether you're laying in bed with your feet up afterwards or whatever the case, when there's no element of trying to conceive, then sex can just be what it is. But then when there is that element, it can really shift the dynamic between the two of you. And one of the ways that I see it in the clients that I work with, and I see it fairly regularly, is that we'll only see sex at that time in the cycle in your fertile window. And one of the things that I always encourage my clients to do when I see that pattern is to really just take a moment to reflect on that overall picture. So from your partner's perspective, if the only time you're having sex is during your fertile window, then you don't want to set it up so that he starts to feel like a sperm donor and that's the only time you want to touch him. I don't think I have to really belabor that. I feel like it's pretty self-evident how that could be negative and have a negative impact on your relationship. And so although it's not easy, I think it is important to consider that and to remember that. And given how stressful it can be trying to conceive, especially the longer that it goes on, I think that it is really important to purposely schedule times outside of your fertile window to have sex with your partner when you know that you can't get pregnant from sex on that day. And I always thought that that was one of the huge benefits of the fertility awareness method, because for couples who are trying to conceive that don't have this roadmap to be able to identify 3 to 5 days of their cycle when they can conceive, then they're trying all the time. And I can't imagine how stressful that would be to fully feel like this pressure of having to try constantly, having sex every day. And there are couples that would have sex every day and feel as though every day could get them pregnant. So they're really actively trying all the time. So for me, I think, wow, that would be the most stressful thing I could ever imagine. Because in my case, when I was trying to conceive both my eldest and youngest son, there was a very few days in each cycle that I could conceive. And so there wasn't this like drawn out 6 months of endless sex. It was not that that's a bad thing, but I think that when there's that element of trying, it does change the dynamic a little bit. But yeah, I mean, there was specific days that we would try on, and then beyond that, the rest of the cycle is kind of free and clear, just for fun. And so I think one of the things that I would encourage you to do is make a point of taking advantage of that wonderful aspect of the fertility awareness method, which is that it helps you to identify which days of your cycle are the best for conception, but then it frees up the rest of the cycle so that there's no stress and pressure on any sex that happens outside of that. So you can really just use those fertile days for trying, and use the rest of your cycle to reconnect with your partner and just have some fun. And I think it's really important to make a point of doing that. And then the last thing that I'll share with you today, the last practical way to improve sex that I wanted to share with you, is taking more time for foreplay. And with that, stop calling it foreplay. So I've touched on this a bit already, but I do think it's important enough for it to have its own little bullet point, which is to really, I would encourage you to expand the definition of sex. So I think I touched on that already in a number of ways, that we typically think of sex as intercourse and everything else as just not sex, or just doesn't have as much weight. And I do think that it can be beneficial to expand that definition of it in the interest of your own pleasure. So as we've spoken about before, women typically are not orgasming, every time from intercourse only. Most women do need clitoral stimulation. And as we talked about the sex cycle and the crockpot analogy, we don't just go from 0 to 100 in a minute. And so taking the time to really enjoy each other and pleasure each other in different ways, it can only be beneficial, and it can only improve your experience overall. And so, there's a number of really great resources out there that are available. And one of the books that I often recommend is a book called She Comes First, The Thinking Man's Guide to Pleasuring a Woman. And that's by Ian Kemmer. I think I might be saying his last name wrong, but either way, you can look it up on Amazon, or you'll find the link to it in the show notes page. But I mean, that's a book written from a man's perspective, all about what is really involved in pleasuring a woman. And that is, I think that there's a lot of men in this world who could benefit from reading that book. And I think there's a lot of women in this world who could benefit from reading that book. And the reason I think that is because it could help to shift your feelings around your own sexual response. I have met a number of women, I can't tell you how many women that I spoke to that really feel bad that they don't orgasm within a certain amount of time. They really think there's something wrong with them. And I can't tell you how many women who I've spoke to over the years who either have never had an orgasm or rarely ever have one during sexual activity. And when they're saying it's totally fine, I enjoy it anyways, I feel like they're trying to convince themselves that that's true. Now, I don't think it's necessary to have an orgasm in order to enjoy sexual activity, but I think that there's no reason why you shouldn't be having one. That's what I think. I think there's no reason why you shouldn't regularly be having an orgasm. I think that orgasms are great, and anything you can do to stack the deck so that the odds are in your favor of having one or several during your sexual activity, we should be implementing some of those strategies. I think that that's really important. And I can't tell you how many women that I've worked with and come into contact with who do have difficulty orgasming and find that they have a lack of sexual desire. And I can't help but wonder how much of that is just related to this script that we typically think that sex is supposed to follow, and how our thoughts and attitudes play into that and support it. So I would say take more time for foreplay and stop calling it foreplay. Instead of thinking of manual stimulation, oral stimulation, all of the different things that you can do with your partner outside of actually intercourse, if you're in a relationship with a partner of the opposite sex, I feel like you really should consider incorporating all of those things into your definition of what sex is and start giving them equal weight in the interest of your own pleasure and enjoyment. And so to close my conversation about sex today, I think that it is fair for me to just take this opportunity to throw the pill under the bus for a little bit. I'm sure that some of you will appreciate that. And so for those of you who, if you're tuning into the podcast for the very first time, welcome. Happy to have you here. I've done a number of shows on the side effects of hormonal contraceptives and how they can impact your cycle and your mood and all kinds of different things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And I think it's really important to point out that there's scientific research that clearly shows the different ways that the pill can impair your libido, your sexual response, and even just your ability to orgasm, your ability to lubricate. And so the pill is associated with a number of negative side effects. And so not every woman is going to experience them, or at least to the same degree, or although I would question how you would even know. So I know for me, when I think back to when I took the pill for the very first time, I was 16. So if it had suppressed my libido, like how would I have known at that time? Like I wasn't sexually active. I wasn't having I don't, if it had suppressed my libido, I wouldn't have known that it did, because I wouldn't have had anything to really compare it to as far as I'm concerned. But regardless of that, there's scientific research that shows a number of different ways that the pill does negatively impact libido. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind as well. So if you're listening and you are on the pill right now, or some version of hormonal contraceptive, or if you've recently come off of it, what's the most disturbing about the way that the pill responds in the body? So there's a couple of different things that happen when you take the pill. One is that it will lower your testosterone. And although we have a tenth of the testosterone that our male counterparts have, we need it. And so the pill lowers the testosterone, but it also increases a hormone called sex hormone binding globulin. And that hormone, it binds to testosterone and makes it so that the testosterone that we have is not available to our cells. And so when you're on hormonal contraceptives, studies have shown that the levels of this sex hormone binding globulin just skyrocket. If you look at a chart, the amount of a woman who is on hormonal contraceptives is 3 or 4 times the amount that a woman has when she's not on hormonal contraceptives. But I think the scariest part of that is that after she comes off of it, so even after you stop taking it, your levels of this sex hormone binding globulin do remain high for some time. So although coming off of the pill, you may experience a return of your libido, for some women that happens quite quickly, and for others it can take quite some time. So just depending on how you respond to it. So I think it's important too, when we're talking about libido, there's a lot to it. So I think it's really important just to come from the perspective that, there's nothing wrong with me, to understand the female sexual response pattern and recognize that it's different to a male sexual response pattern. But with that being said, there may be other factors that are contributing to libido or desire, or even your ability to orgasm, or how intense your orgasms are, that could be hormonal. And so I think it's important just to throw that in there just for informational sake, so that we've covered some of our bases in our discussion today. And so that's it. That's what I wanted to chat with you about today. And so I just want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You'll find the show notes for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/128. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode and did find some useful tidbits and nuggets in my discussion of sex today. It's an area that I'm really passionate about. Get it? Passionate, pun intended. And I really feel strongly that why should women have any less pleasure, passion, enjoyment from sex than men? And it's really interesting, actually, in one of the meetings that I had with my group program participants, when we were talking about sex and other topics, one of the women in the group, she said, well, if there was something like the pill for men and it caused them to have even anything close to the side effects that we have to endure on hormonal contraceptives, it would be pulled off the market immediately. And to which I responded that there actually was that. So for a number of years, the researchers and scientists out there who are manufacturing synthetic hormones have been trying to create a similar product to the pill for men. And there was an actual research study where they did create a hormonal contraceptive for men. And during the study, there was a number of men who reported side effects such as depression and anxiety, quite similar to the effects that women have all the time on hormonal contraceptives. And they actually pulled the study. They didn't finish the study. They stopped the study midway because of the effects that the drug was having on men. And I found that to be fascinating. So I wanted to share that with you. So that's like a total side note. But yes, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you were able to find some useful tidbits of information there because yes, I do feel very passionate about women enjoying and experiencing pleasure based on our actual sex cycles as opposed to some mythical idea of, how we're supposed to respond in sexual situations. And so if you enjoyed the conversation that I had with you today about sex and also fertility awareness and how these things interrelate, I want to invite you to join my upcoming group programs. Enrollment is now open and the next group is going to be starting in April of 2017. And I would absolutely love to have you as part of the group while we still have spaces available. And so to learn more about how you can be part of my next group program, head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program and apply today. And so you might be wondering what we're going to cover in the group program. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. The group program is 10 weeks long. It's a really unique experience, not like anything else that I really know of that's out there. And during that 10 weeks, we really dive in deeply into the fertility awareness method aspect of things. So by the time that you finish the group, you will be 100% confident in your ability to interpret your mucus, understand your temperature patterns, understand why some cycles you may see variation, and you'll have a much deeper understanding of how all of these things fit together. If you're wanting to use the method for birth control, you will know exactly how the rules work and recognize how it's possible to use this method and have no gray area. Every day is either fertile or not, and you'll know exactly how to identify that. If you're using the method to try to conceive or wherever you are on the path, if you know that you may need it for birth control in the future, or if you know that you may want it to try to conceive in the future, one of the important aspects of the group as well is to really delve into how your menstrual cycle health is connected to your overall health. And so one of the things that we talk about in the group is what your cycle is actually saying about your health. And so we look at your cycle and really dive into the root cause if we see things that are off and really gain a deeper understanding as to why that might be. And so I would love to have you in the group. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information. And I would like to thank you again for hanging out with me today. I do appreciate all of you for taking the time and letting me be part of your day. And I love that you take me with you on your commutes to work, or if you're going for a jog or walking the dog. I have the best listeners. The Fertility Friday community is the best. And ultimately, without you, I wouldn't have a podcast. So thank you so much. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.